At Beyond Borders, this is James Naughty talking to Alex Salmond, MP, and still MSP, of course, former First Minister of Scotland. You've had a ringside seat at events which, in some respects, you organised over the last 18 months. Where do you think politics stands UK-wide at the moment?
Well, I think I was in the arena, not so much watching on. But it's quite interesting, I suppose, to having over the last year being as it were, one of the boxers in the ring, to being, in a certain sense, a spectator of some of the aspects. It gives you a different perspective on things. I think this is the most fascinating period in politics. We've just been doing an interview, Jim, where I was talking about what was happening this day last year, and it's amazing, totally amazing, the total transformation in the political scene over that period of time, with all sorts of things happening in Scotland, happening at UK level, but happening internationally, all which are mixing into the questions we have before us in Scotland. I can't think of a political period where so much has happened in so compressed a period of time.
When you look at the House of Commons, to which you've returned after some years' absence, do you think it is better equipped to cope with the challenges that you mention, or not?
Probably not. I mean, there's obviously been dramatic changes. I think the group that the SNP has elected, perhaps because of choice, but perhaps by serendipity, but for whatever reason, is richly talented. I can't think of a more talented group than this one. But if you look at the context, when I went to House of Commons at first, right, I would go into the chamber to listen to Tony Benn and the Labour benches and just listen to what he said. And I necessarily agree with it, but that's not the point. I agreed with some things. I'd go to listen to John Biffin. Didn't necessarily agree with it. I agreed with some things. John Biffin had forgotten more about English history than the most of the current crop of English MPs had ever learned. I think there's some talented MPs without doubt, but I think that the general standard has gone down. The SNP feisty 56 apart, and there is, and you tried to think, is this because you're getting older and you're getting some old fogey view of the world, things aren't what they were, blah blah blah. And I do my best to try and look at these things rationally, and I compare some of the figures from then and now, and I think the standard has declined. So whether it has the accommodation, the second thing I think is the Whitehall civil service has been denuded of some of its best talent. I deprecate some Tory ministers, particularly in the coalition government, always condemn civil servants not doing this, that, and the next thing. I think that's just total nonsense. But I look at someone like Gus O'Donnell, serious civil servant in my view. And is there an equivalent now in the framework of governance? I don't think so. The Chilcot thing, there is a distrust abroad of the person and people who've been appointed to lead a major inquiry into an earth-shattering event. Now, we're all said and done, and no doubt inquiries have been stitched up in the past, but by and large, on the whole, if you got to the Franks inquiry, then people by and large accepted they were going to get a square result. So I just wonder if there's been a lowering of standard across the board in the body politic at Westminster.
Well, that's a very interesting point, and it's a paradox, really, isn't it? You've been a representative in your time of an insurgent force, in Westminster terms, still an insurgent force. You've also been a First Minister of Scotland, running a government minority and then majority for 8 years. You understand that political authority, the ability to be believed on crucial issues, is terribly important.
I do.
And how do you get that back?
Well, I do think that's the case, and I also think it. See, when policy differences are set aside, when people accept, look, we are elected on the platform that's to pursue it, you can still do business. I was blessed as First Minister with two high-ranking and highly affected permanent secretaries in Scotland. They were dealing with what I regarded as trustworthy cabinet secretaries. So when all the the kind of political bandage was thrown back and forward in government meetings, you actually knew that if it came to an issue, you could get a deal done, you could get business transacted. I'm kind of wondering in the present setup if that is actually the case. I mean, I see what I see is a diminution of standard. I see a politicisation of the civil service. I see a gutting of the BBC, quite deliberately by the present government as a public service broadcaster. And so I just wonder if there's going to be a general distrust of the institutions of state. Now, that doesn't mean, distrust in the sense that people have differences. I'm just saying distrust that the people who are meant to be Hudden and Jacobs, as we might say in Scotland, are no longer to be trusted to be good referees.
Some people would argue that you politicised the civil service in Edinburgh because you were so dominant that people felt that they couldn't argue against you. What's your response to that?
Oh, I think it's nonsense. I mean, if you take John Elvidge, John, incidentally, is doing
Who was permanent secretary in your last
my
period?
first permanent secretary is doing a fantastic job that's now going around civil service colleges talking about the changes that were made in the Scottish civil service. And I think John, and it's probably a tribute to John, is I have absolutely no idea what John Elvidge's politics are. I have no idea. I've known him so well, as you do your permanent secretary for a number of years. But I don't think John would ever make that case. And I saw Peter Houston. Now, he's free of the burden of being in office, made a speech recently. And the last thing he would argue is that the civil service in Scotland were pressurised. What the civil service in Scotland did, and what John Elvis established, of course, is the civil service were there to implement the political wishes of the government which had been duly elected by the Scottish people.
And to argue back if they think they won't work.
And to argue back. But I was quite interested. There was a recent issue in Whitehall that there had to be a ministerial direction for the charity. I think I'm right in saying in 8 years as First Minister of Scotland, I had one ministerial direction offered to me, which I don't think actually came to pass.
This is the civil servant saying, look, we wondered whether this is the right thing to do. And the point was made, you're referring to the issue involving Kids Company. And somebody said that in recent years, I think in the last decade, in Whitehall there had only been 3. Yeah. So it's quite rare as well.
It's a very rare thing. And so that's an interesting template. My view is that politicians who blame the civil service for being obstructionist or obstacles are just bad politicians. But my view is also that civil servants, quite rightly, if they're properly, if there's a proper balance between the political directive and the civil service implementation, it's a good combination. Where you get into problems is where the direction is confused, as perhaps the coalition was, or alternatively where the civil servants, as I believe certain Whitehall civil servants currently are, believe they really should have been politicians, in which case they should stand for election.
Let me ask you about Scotland. You lost the referendum. You had expected to win it, and you've said you expected to win it on the morning of the vote. You were wrong. Do you think that independence on that basis will come about in your political lifetime? Well,
in fairness, it's the only election in my life that I haven't judged properly, or referendum. Every other one I've got right. Even the ones that
Why did you get it wrong?
I don't know. I suspect.
Did you get carried away with yourself?
No, not with myself. I suspect it was if you remember the Chris Mullen book. There's I think I'm right in saying
the very British coup.
Yeah. But I'm not about a coup or anything like that. But I think I'm right in saying, and I may be confusing it with another thing, but there is a period where the leader of the Labour Party in the book talks about the crowds he's experiencing on the campaign trail, and I think for any politician, even an experienced one, I'd never registered or seen or experienced a level of enthusiasm the like of which I experienced in the last month of the referendum campaign.
Felt the same in 1983 and got the lowest level of Labour vote since 1929.
Well, in my defence, I think Michael Foot got 26%. We got
7, I think, but let's not argue about the figures.
Yeah.
No, I'm not comparing the two.
I'm not going to argue about it right, but 45% referendum is probably a bit more.
No, that's a perfectly fair point. But
I think it's true that I mean, it wasn't just incidentally the normal political register. Remember, we had people involved. You're talking about a 98% registration and an 85% turnout. So we were in territory which was uncharted in recent.
But you hadn't expected.
Well,
you didn't think my understanding is that your party thought the turnout would be 79 or 80,
80%.
but not 85.
I always said 80%, and everybody said that's rubbish. Referendums have got 50% in the devolution referendum or something, and I said no, this will be a big thing for it. But 85%, in a certain sense, you're probably right. 85% was the last 5%.
Was too big for you. It was too big for you.
But nonetheless, to touch that experience. Was it wishful thinking? My political instincts in these things are usually very good, Jim, and I was wrong on the referendum. There's some compensation. I was right in the general election.
Do you think that a second referendum will happen in the course of the next Parliament?
Well, these matters are very much for two. No, I was going to say for Nicola Sturgeon, but it's not just Nicola Sturgeon, it's for Nicola Sturgeon and the Scottish people. As Nicola makes the point quite rightly, you can only have a referendum if people vote you in on that platform. But these things, look, I'm the former leader of the Scottish National Party, and the last thing I would ever do is tell the present leader of the Scottish National Party how to go about our business.
Would you like another one soon?
Well, I think there's no yes supporter, and there's a good number of previous no supporters think that there are issues coming up which will mean that the issue should be put to the touch once again. Nicola has identified the European issue. I think that's a legitimate and very important issue to identify. I'm seeing the government failing to redeem the vow that they made to convince people in the last 2 weeks of the referendum, and I'll go through this point by point if you wish. And secondly, I'm seeing a level of austerity economics which no one, not even Conservatives, I suspect, in the run-up to general election could possibly envisage in terms of the degree to which the poor and vulnerable are being penalised for economic
You're going through the things you don't agree with. But
no, they're more than that, Jim.
Okay, you've made your point very strongly. Would you argue, if you felt things had got to a point where you needed the question to be put again, would you be prepared to argue for it? Even if Nicola Sturgeon didn't decide that she wanted it.
I'll tell you what, political parties have a collective leadership, and the SNP
you wouldn't?
Has always had a collective leadership. But it's useful, I think, in any political organisation for there to be no ambiguity about who is the leader. And there's no ambiguity. Nicola Sturgeon is the leader of the Scottish National Party.
So you would not second guess her on the referendum?
Look, past leaders should certainly be seen and heard. But there are certain issues which they should leave to the present one.
Are you enjoying being back in the House of Commons?
Yeah, absolutely.
What's good about it?
Well, what's good about it is I'm with a bunch of colleagues, and I'm going to say it again, Jim, because it's absolutely true. In terms of quality, I've never seen a parliamentary group with as much depth and excitement and variation as this one. This is an exceptional bunch of colleagues. If I'd been going back to my maximum previous number of colleagues was 5, incidentally. If I'd been going back to, with the greatest one in the world, I did that when I was 30. You don't do it again when you're 60. So that would have been two things. But to be with such a group of people is a great pleasure. Also, I think the political situation is more interesting. I think there are opportunities. That this is an absolute, an overall majority of the Conservatives, but you and I both either witnessed or participated in the major years when he had a majority of 21, not a majority of 12. So there are parliamentary opportunities, and there are big issues. Issues for Scotland, but underlying issues in the body politics. There are lots of people who are suffering very badly, incidentally, from the current direction of politics. But for a politician, this is a fascinating period. This is a period where lots of things could be possible.
At Beyond Borders, Alex Salmond, thank you very much.
Great pleasure.